Sign the family trust tonight, Daniel, because that lottery money belongs to all of us, Linda Harper said across the dinner table, her voice calm but firm enough to freeze the room. The words hung in the air like something heavy and unfamiliar, and for a moment no one touched their plates. Daniel Harper had imagined a lot of reactions when his parents heard he'd won the lottery, but this wasn't one of them. 48 hours earlier, he had been standing in line at a convenience store just outside Columbus, Ohio, still wearing his grease-stained work shirt from the auto garage, where he worked 5 days a week. He'd bought a ticket the same way he always did, almost out of habit, expecting nothing more than the small thrill of checking the numbers later that night. Instead, he woke up the next morning staring at the television screen, while the news anchor calmly repeated the winning numbers and the name of the town where the ticket had been sold. $2.4 million. It didn't feel real then, and it didn't feel real now as he sat in his parents' dining room with a fork in his hand and the smell of Linda's pot roast filling the house he'd grown up in. The Harper home had always been the kind of place where Sunday dinners meant comfort food and long conversations about ordinary things: gas prices, neighborhood gossip, the Cleveland Browns losing another close game. But tonight was different. The table looked the same oak surface Daniel had helped sand and refinish with his father years ago, the same framed family photos on the wall behind Linda's chair. Yet the mood felt tight, like something invisible had pulled the room a few inches smaller. Melissa Harper, Daniel's older sister, sat across from him quietly swirling her iced tea with a straw, glancing at their mother every few seconds as if waiting for a signal. Robert Harper, their father, had barely spoken since Daniel arrived. Normally Robert was the one telling stories about work or making dry jokes that made Linda roll her eyes. But tonight he stared down at his plate, cutting his meat into careful squares without eating much of it. Daniel had come to the dinner thinking it would be a celebration. After all, he'd called them as soon as the lottery office confirmed the win. His first words had been, "Mom, Dad, I think my life just changed." He'd pictured hugs, maybe a toast, maybe his father clapping him on the back and saying he was proud of him. Instead, Linda had paused on the phone for a long moment before saying, "Why don't you come over tomorrow night? We should have a family meeting." The phrase family meeting had sounded strange at the time, but Daniel assumed it was just Linda's way of organizing things the way she always did. She liked plans, lists, and tidy solutions. Still, as he looked around the table now, Daniel began to understand that tonight wasn't about celebrating anything. Linda folded her hands neatly beside her plate, the way she did when she was about to explain something she had already decided was reasonable. "Daniel," she said gently, "you've been blessed with something extraordinary. But money like that affects the whole family." Melissa nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Exactly. It's not just about you anymore. It changes things for everyone." Daniel blinked, trying to follow the logic. "I mean, sure, I want to help out," he said carefully. "I was actually thinking about paying off the mortgage here, maybe setting up college funds for Melissa's kids." Linda smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile he expected. It was the careful smile she used when she believed she was being patient with someone who didn't yet understand the bigger picture. "That's kind of you," she said. "But generosity needs structure. That's why we've already spoken with an estate attorney about creating a family trust." Daniel's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "You spoke to a lawyer?" Melissa leaned forward. "Just to get information. Nothing official yet." Linda continued smoothly. "The idea is simple. You place the money in the trust, and your father and I manage it responsibly, so it benefits the entire family long term." Daniel stared at them, trying to process what he'd just heard. 2 days ago, he had been fixing brake pads and worrying about rent. Now his mother was talking about managing his lottery winnings like it was already a shared asset. He turned toward his father instinctively, expecting Robert to laugh or shake his head and say Linda was getting ahead of herself. But Robert didn't laugh. Instead, he set down his fork slowly, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and pushed his chair back. From the table, the legs scraped softly against the hardwood floor. Everyone looked at him. For a moment, Robert Harper seemed like he might say something, but he didn't. He just stood there, his expression unreadable, and walked out of the dining room toward the back door. The screen door creaked open, then closed again. Outside, the quiet hum of summer insects drifted in from the yard. Daniel glanced back at Linda, confused. Dessert hadn't even been served yet. And somehow the most ordinary family dinner he'd ever known had just turned into something he didn't recognize at all. The screen door closed behind Robert Harper with a quiet thud, and for several seconds the dining room remained completely silent except for the faint clink of ice shifting inside Melissa's glass. Daniel sat there staring toward the hallway where his father had disappeared, trying to understand what had just happened. Robert Harper was not the kind of man who walked away from the dinner table. For as long as Daniel could remember, his father believed that once a family sat down together, everyone stayed until the last plate was cleared. Linda Harper seemed determined to pretend nothing unusual had happened. She reached calmly for the serving dish and placed another spoonful of mashed potatoes onto Daniel's plate, as if the evening were unfolding exactly the way she expected. "Your father has always been uncomfortable talking about money," she said in a measured voice. "That is all." Melissa nodded quickly again, though she looked toward the back door for a moment as if she had expected Robert to return. Daniel lowered his fork slowly. The potatoes had gone cold. The warm, comforting smell of dinner now felt strangely heavy, like the air inside the room had thickened. "Mom," Daniel said carefully, "I did not even know you had talked to a lawyer." Linda folded her hands again. "It was only a consultation. Families with sudden wealth should be responsible. That is all I am saying." Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Only 3 days earlier, his biggest financial decision had been whether he could afford to replace the worn tires on his pickup truck before winter. He had spent most of his adult life living paycheck to paycheck, working at Dawson's Auto Garage on the east side of Columbus. The garage was the kind of place where the radio played classic rock all day and customers paid in cash half the time. Daniel liked the work because it was simple and honest. Engines made sense. Broken parts could be fixed with the right tools and enough patience. People were harder to figure out, especially tonight. Melissa cleared her throat. "Daniel, you have to understand something. $2.4 million sounds like a lot, but after taxes it is not as huge as people think. It needs to be handled carefully." Daniel looked at her with mild surprise. "You already calculated the taxes?" Melissa shrugged as if the question were obvious. Anyone would. Linda continued speaking before Daniel could respond again. "A family trust protects everyone. It ensures stability. Your father and I would oversee the funds, make investments, and distribute support when necessary." The phrase "distribute support" echoed strangely in Daniel's mind. He had always been the one borrowing tools from his father or asking Linda for advice about fixing something around his small apartment. Suddenly the conversation sounded as if the roles had quietly reversed, and someone had decided he no longer owned his own future. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck slowly. The kitchen clock ticked loudly on the wall behind Linda. "I have not even received the money yet," he said. "The lottery office said the payment will take a few weeks." Linda smiled again in that calm, organized way she had. "Which means we have time to prepare." Melissa added quickly, "It is actually very smart planning." Daniel glanced again toward the back door where his father had walked out. Through the window, he could see the faint yellow glow of the porch light stretching across the backyard lawn. Robert's old pickup truck was still parked beside the shed. That meant his father had not left the property. He was just outside somewhere in the dark. The thought lingered quietly in Daniel's mind. Robert Harper had not said a single word during the entire discussion about the trust. He had simply listened. And then he had stood up and walked out before dessert. Daniel pushed his chair back slightly and stood. "Where are you going?" Melissa asked. "Just to check on Dad," Daniel replied. Linda opened her mouth as if she might stop him, but then she closed it again and picked up her fork. As Daniel stepped into the cool evening air, the tension inside the house followed him like a shadow. Somewhere near the edge of the yard, he could see his father standing beside the fence, looking out toward the quiet Ohio fields beyond the neighborhood. The porch light illuminated only part of his face, but Daniel could already tell from the way Robert's shoulders were set that whatever had just happened inside the house was far from over. Daniel walked slowly across the yard toward the fence where Robert Harper stood, the cool Ohio evening air carrying the distant hum of traffic from the highway a few miles away. The backyard looked exactly the same as it always had. The same wooden fence Daniel had helped repair during high school, the same maple tree near the corner of the yard, the same patch of grass where Melissa used to set up a small inflatable pool every summer for her children. Nothing about the place had changed, and yet something felt very different tonight. Robert did not turn when Daniel approached. He kept his eyes fixed on the dark stretch of farmland beyond the neighborhood where the streetlights ended and the horizon faded into quiet open fields. Daniel stopped beside him and leaned lightly against the fence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of crickets filled the silence between them. Finally, Daniel said quietly, "Dad, what just happened in there?" Robert exhaled slowly through his nose. The porch light behind them cast a soft glow across his face, revealing the deep lines around his eyes that had grown more noticeable over the years. "Your mother has been planning that conversation for 2 days," Robert said. Daniel turned his head in surprise. 2 days? Robert nodded once. "Ever since you called about the lottery." Daniel felt a strange tightening in his chest. The timeline suddenly made more sense now. The quick invitation to dinner. The phrase family meeting. The way Melissa already seemed prepared with numbers and opinions about taxes and investments. Robert rested his forearms on the top of the fence. "Your mother means well," he continued after a moment. "She has always believed that families should share responsibility." Daniel let out a short breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh. "Responsibility for what?" "It is my ticket." Robert finally looked at him. His expression was calm, but serious. "Exactly." Daniel studied his father's face carefully. Robert. Harper had never been a dramatic man. He spent 30 years working at a manufacturing plant outside the city, the kind of job where people measured success by showing up on time every morning and doing honest work until retirement. Robert believed in simple rules. Pay your bills. Take care of your family. Do not spend money you do not have. Daniel remembered all the evenings growing up when his father would sit at the kitchen table balancing the household budget with a calculator and a stack of envelopes. Money had always been treated with caution in the Harper household, almost like something slightly dangerous if handled the wrong way. "So why did you walk out?" Daniel asked. Robert looked back toward the house where the kitchen window glowed warmly in the darkness. "Because the conversation inside that room stopped being about family and started being about control." The word control settled heavily in Daniel's mind. "Mom thinks she is helping," he said. Robert nodded slowly. "Your mother believes structure solves everything. She believes if she organizes the money properly, no one will make mistakes." Daniel rubbed his hands together against the cool evening air. "And you disagree?" Robert turned fully toward him now. "Daniel, listen carefully. $2.4 million is a lot of money for someone who has never had it before. It can change the way people think. Even people you love." Daniel felt the weight of that sentence settle somewhere deep in his chest. "You mean Mom and Melissa?" Robert did not answer directly. Instead, he said quietly, "Your mother called that lawyer yesterday morning before she even spoke to you about dinner." Daniel blinked. "Yesterday?" Robert nodded again. "I was sitting at the kitchen table when she made the call." For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. The crickets continued their steady chorus around the yard, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and then fell silent again. Inside the house, the dining room lights still glowed, and Daniel could imagine Linda and Melissa sitting at the table finishing dessert while discussing numbers and plans that already assumed his agreement. Robert rested a hand briefly on Daniel's shoulder. "Son," he said quietly, "do not let anyone rush you into decisions about that money. Not even family." Daniel looked back toward the house where he had spent most of his life believing that. Everyone inside those walls wanted the same simple things. Tonight he was beginning to realize that winning the lottery had not just changed his future. It had changed the way everyone around him saw it. Daniel remained beside the fence for several more seconds after Robert finished speaking, letting the weight of his father's words settle slowly in his mind. The quiet Ohio night seemed unusually still, as if the entire neighborhood had paused along with him. Somewhere down the street a car passed, its headlights briefly sweeping across the tops of the houses before disappearing again. Daniel crossed his arms and looked back toward the dining room window. Through the glass, he could see Linda and Melissa still sitting at the table. His mother's posture was upright and composed, her hands moving calmly as she spoke, while Melissa leaned forward with the same eager expression she had worn during the conversation earlier. They looked comfortable, almost confident. That image alone told Daniel something important. They were not waiting for him to return so the discussion could begin again. In their minds, the discussion had never really paused. It had simply moved outside with him and Robert. "You should probably go back in," Robert said quietly after a moment. "Your mother will expect that." Daniel nodded slowly, but did not move right away. His thoughts were drifting through memories of the last few days, replaying small moments that had seemed harmless at the time. The morning after he confirmed the winning ticket, he had stopped by the garage to tell his coworkers the news. They had laughed, slapped him on the back, and joked about him finally being able to afford a truck that did not make a rattling sound every time he started the engine. Later that afternoon, Linda had called him again. Her voice had been unusually focused. She asked detailed questions about the payment process, the taxes, and whether he planned to take the money as a lump sum or in annual installments. Daniel had assumed she was simply worried about him making a mistake. That was how Linda Harper had always shown care for her family. She organized problems before they appeared. Robert seemed to read the direction of Daniel's thoughts. "Your mother believes planning ahead is the same as protecting you," he said. "But sometimes planning ahead becomes deciding for someone else." Daniel let out a slow breath. Melissa seemed pretty comfortable with the idea too. Robert gave a small nod. "Melissa has 2 children and a mortgage. She sees opportunity where your mother sees responsibility." The honesty in Robert's voice was not bitter, just steady and direct. Daniel appreciated that. His father had never been the type to hide uncomfortable truths behind polite words. Daniel straightened up from the fence and glanced again toward the house. The kitchen light reflected softly on the window glass. From this distance, he could not hear what Linda and Melissa were saying, but he could easily imagine the conversation. They were probably discussing numbers again. $2.4 million sounded enormous when people said it out loud, but Daniel knew the actual amount after taxes would be closer to $1.5 million. Enough to change his life, but not enough to support an entire extended family forever. Robert pushed himself away from the fence and looked at his son carefully. "Daniel, I am not telling you to distrust your family," he said. "I am telling you to think clearly before you sign anything." Daniel nodded once more. "I will." Robert studied his face for a moment longer, then gave a small approving nod. "Good." The porch light cast long shadows across the yard as Daniel started walking back toward the house. Each step felt slightly heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because the conversation inside the dining room now meant something very different than it had an hour earlier. When he reached the back door, he paused with his hand on the handle. Through the window, he could see Linda turning toward the hallway as if she sensed him approaching. Melissa was already looking up from the table. Their expressions were calm, patient, and expectant. Daniel realized in that moment that the real conversation about the lottery money had not even begun yet. The dinner had only been the opening move. Daniel stepped back into the kitchen and felt the warmth of the house wrap around him again. But the comfort he once associated with this place no longer felt the same. Linda Harper looked up immediately, her expression composed as if the interruption had simply been part of the evening's schedule. Melissa sat with her hands folded on the table beside an untouched slice of apple pie that had already begun to cool. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples filled the room, but the sweetness of dessert felt strangely out of place after the conversation Daniel had just had outside. Linda watched him closely as he returned to the table. "Is your father finished with his walk?" she asked calmly. Daniel pulled out his chair and sat down slowly. "He is still outside." Linda gave a small nod, as though that answer confirmed something she had already expected. She slid the pie dish slightly closer to Daniel. "You should eat something before we continue talking," she said. Daniel looked at the plate for a moment, but did not pick up his fork. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and studied his mother's face carefully. Linda Harper had always been the calm center of their household. When Daniel was growing up, she managed everything with quiet precision, from grocery lists to school schedules to holiday dinners that appeared effortless even though they required days of preparation. She believed that good planning solved most problems. Tonight, it seemed she believed planning could solve this one as well. Melissa broke the silence first. "Daniel, we were just discussing the structure of the trust again," she said, her tone polite but eager. "It really is the safest way to handle the money." Daniel glanced between them. "You two kept discussing it while I was outside." Melissa gave a small shrug. "It is an important decision." Linda folded her hands on the table again in the same deliberate way she had earlier. "Daniel, I know this feels sudden to you, but opportunities like this do not come often in life. When they do, responsible families act quickly to protect them." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Protect them from what?" Linda's expression remained patient. "From mistakes." Daniel let the words sit in the air for a moment. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall above the refrigerator. Outside the window, the dark yard stretched quietly beyond the porch light. "Mom," Daniel said slowly, "I have not even touched the money yet." Linda nodded. "Exactly. That is why this is the right time to organize everything." Melissa leaned forward again, her voice becoming more animated. "If the money goes into a family trust, the investments could grow over time. Think about what that could mean for everyone. College funds for the kids, security for mom and dad's retirement, maybe even property investments." Daniel noticed the way she said the word everyone again. The conversation was beginning to follow the same pattern as before, but now Daniel was hearing it differently. Each suggestion sounded less like advice and more like expectation. Linda opened a thin folder that had been resting beside her plate. Daniel had not noticed it earlier during dinner. Inside were several neatly printed documents held together with a silver paper clip. "These are only preliminary outlines," Linda explained calmly. "Nothing official yet. But the attorney we spoke with prepared a few possible structures." Daniel stared at the papers. "You already had him draft documents?" Linda did not seem embarrassed by the question. "Just examples," she said, "to help you understand the options." Melissa nodded enthusiastically. The lawyer said it would make everything simpler. Daniel felt a quiet realization forming in the back of his mind. The folder, the prepared explanations, the careful timing of the dinner invitation. None of this had been spontaneous. Linda closed the folder again and placed her hands on top of it. "Daniel," she said gently, "all we are asking is that you trust your family to help guide this situation." For several seconds Daniel said nothing. His eyes rested on the folder in front of his mother, then moved slowly to Melissa, who was watching him with hopeful anticipation. The room felt very still. Finally Daniel spoke, his voice calm but thoughtful. "Before I sign anything," he said quietly, "I think I should speak with the lawyer myself." Melissa blinked in surprise. Linda's expression remained composed, but something in her posture shifted slightly, almost too subtle to notice. And in that moment Daniel realized that the real negotiation about his future had just begun. For a few seconds the kitchen remained completely quiet after Daniel spoke. Melissa's hopeful expression faded into uncertainty, and Linda Harper sat very still with her hands resting on top of the folder as if she were carefully deciding how to respond. The ticking of the wall clock suddenly sounded louder than before. Finally Linda offered a calm smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Of course you can speak with the attorney," she said gently. "That is exactly what responsible people do." Melissa shifted slightly in her chair. "It is the same lawyer Mom already spoke to," she added quickly. "So everything will stay simple." Daniel nodded slowly, but he did not look at the folder again. Instead he leaned back in his chair and studied both of them with a quiet attentiveness that had not been there earlier in the evening. Something inside him had changed during the conversation outside with his father. Before that moment he had entered the house assuming everyone wanted the same thing for him. Now he was beginning to understand that every person at the table might be imagining a different future for the same money. Linda noticed the shift in his expression. She closed the folder carefully and slid it a few inches away from the center of the table. "Daniel," she said in the same calm tone she used whenever she believed she was guiding someone toward the right decision. "This situation is new for all of us. But your father and I have spent our entire lives managing a household. We know how quickly money can disappear when people are not careful." Daniel nodded again, acknowledging the truth in part of what she said. Growing up, he had watched his parents stretch every paycheck with discipline and patience. There were years when vacations were replaced by simple weekends at home because the roof needed repairs or the car required maintenance. Linda had always believed stability mattered more than luxury. Melissa leaned forward again, her voice softer now but still persistent. "Nobody is trying to take anything from you," she said. "We just want to make sure everything is handled wisely. You could easily make mistakes if you try to manage all of this alone." Daniel looked directly at her. "Maybe," he replied calmly, "but mistakes would still be mine to make." The sentence settled into the room with quiet weight. Melissa opened her mouth as if she wanted to argue, but then closed it again. Linda watched her son closely for a moment, studying his face in a way that reminded Daniel of the times she used to observe him when he was a child trying to solve a difficult math problem at the kitchen table. She seemed to be measuring something. "There is no rush tonight," Linda finally said. "You can think about everything we discussed." Daniel stood up slowly from his chair. That is exactly what I plan to do. Through the back window, he could still see the faint outline of his father near the fence, standing quietly beneath the porch light. The steady presence of that silhouette gave Daniel a strange sense of clarity. When he looked back at the table, the apple pie remained untouched, and the folder containing the lawyer's documents sat quietly between his mother and sister like a silent proposal waiting for an answer. Daniel understood now that the lottery had not only brought opportunity into his life. It had introduced expectations, assumptions, and quiet plans that had already begun forming around him. And for the first time since hearing the winning numbers on the television broadcast 2 nights earlier, Daniel realized something important. The most valuable decision he would make about that money would not be how to spend it. It would be deciding who actually had a say in what happened next. Daniel left the house later that night with more questions than answers. The drive back to his small apartment across town felt longer than usual, even though the distance was less than 12 miles. Streetlights passed rhythmically through the windshield as his old pickup truck rolled along the quiet Ohio roads. Normally, the steady hum of the engine relaxed him, but tonight his mind replayed every moment of the dinner conversation. The folder on the table. Melissa calculating taxes before the money had even arrived. His mother already speaking with a lawyer before anyone had asked him what he actually wanted to do. When he finally parked outside his apartment building, the clock on the dashboard showed almost 11:30. Daniel sat there for a moment with the engine off, listening to the faint ticking sound as the truck cooled. Winning the lottery was supposed to feel exciting. For most people it meant freedom, opportunity, maybe even peace of mind. Instead, Daniel felt something else creeping into the edges of his thoughts. Caution. The next morning's sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of his apartment as Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the small kitchen table. The place was modest, barely 800 square feet, but it had always been enough for him. The furniture was simple. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner. Nothing about the apartment suggested someone who had just become a millionaire. That thought made Daniel smile faintly. For now, nothing had actually changed yet. The money was still weeks away from arriving. After finishing his coffee, he picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name Grace Miller. Grace had been his friend since high school, and one of the few people he trusted to speak honestly when something did not feel right. She now worked as an accountant at a financial consulting firm in downtown Columbus. When she answered the call, her voice sounded bright and curious. Daniel Harper calling me before noon on a weekday? That already sounds suspicious, she joked. Daniel laughed quietly. I might need some advice. Grace listened patiently while he explained the dinner at his parents' house, the discussion about the trust, and the folder of documents his mother had placed on the table. When he finished, there was a short pause on the other end of the line. Let me ask you something, Grace said carefully. Did anyone explain exactly who would control the trust? Daniel thought about the conversation for a moment. My parents would manage it. Grace did not respond immediately. Daniel could almost hear her thinking. Daniel, she finally said, her tone becoming more serious. That kind of arrangement can give someone full authority over how the money is invested and distributed. Daniel stared down at the wood grain of his kitchen table. So it means they would technically control the money. It means they could, Grace replied. Which is why you should never sign anything without independent advice. The phrase independent advice echoed the same warning his father had given him the night before. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Mom already contacted the lawyer who drafted the trust outline. Grace gave a small sigh. That lawyer represents the person who hired him, not you. Daniel looked out the window toward the quiet parking lot below his apartment. A few neighbors were leaving for work, carrying coffee cups and briefcases, completely unaware that someone upstairs had just discovered how complicated sudden wealth could become. Grace spoke again, her voice firm but supportive. You need your own attorney. Someone who works only for you. Daniel nodded, even though she could not see him. I was starting to think the same thing. As he ended the call, Daniel felt a new clarity settling into his thoughts. The lottery ticket had given him something valuable, but the decisions ahead would determine whether that gift remained his or slowly turned into something controlled by others. And for the first time since the winning numbers appeared on that television screen, Daniel understood that the most important step forward was not signing a document. It was making sure he had someone standing beside him who was truly on his side. The following afternoon, Daniel parked his pickup truck in front of a modest brick office building in downtown Columbus, Ohio, where Grace Miller had arranged a meeting for him. The sign beside the glass entrance door read Carter and Wells Financial Advisory. The building was not impressive in the flashy way Daniel once imagined wealthy professionals might work, but the quiet professionalism of the place felt reassuring. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood. Grace was already waiting near the reception desk, holding a slim folder beneath her arm. She greeted him with a friendly smile that quickly shifted into a more serious expression as they sat down in a small meeting room overlooking the street. "I am glad you came," Grace said. "Most people who suddenly come into money do not stop to think about the pressure that appears around them." Daniel nodded slowly. "I am starting to see that." Grace opened the folder and placed several documents on the table. None of them were contracts. They were simply outlines explaining different ways people protected personal wealth. She spoke calmly, explaining concepts Daniel had never heard before, such as financial independence, asset management, and personal legal representation. The information was not overwhelming, but it was eye-opening. For the first time since winning the lottery, Daniel felt like someone was giving him information rather than expectations. After about 20 minutes, Grace leaned back slightly in her chair. "Let me ask you something honestly," she said. "Do you trust your parents?" Daniel thought about the question carefully. "Yes," he answered after a moment. "But that does not mean I want to lose control of my own decisions." Grace nodded with quiet approval. "That is a healthy way to look at it." She slid one of the papers across the table toward him. It contained the name of a local attorney who specialized in representing lottery winners and small business owners who suddenly experienced financial growth. "This lawyer works only for the person who hires him," she explained. "Not for families, not for organizations, just for his client." Daniel looked down at the name printed on the page. "Michael Turner." Grace continued, speaking in a calm, practical tone. "If your parents already spoke with another attorney, that lawyer represents them. It does not make him dishonest, but it does mean his responsibility is to the person who contacted him first." Daniel absorbed that thought carefully. It matched exactly what Grace had told him earlier on the phone. Across the street outside the office window, he could see people walking along the sidewalk carrying lunch bags and coffee cups, living ordinary lives that had not suddenly been complicated by unexpected wealth. For a moment, he envied that simplicity. Grace closed the folder and rested her hands on the table. "You are not doing anything wrong by protecting your independence," she said. "Responsible decisions sometimes look uncomfortable to people who expect something else." Daniel nodded slowly. He could already imagine how the next family conversation might unfold when he explained that he planned to hire his own lawyer before signing anything. His mother would probably stay calm, but disappointed. Melissa might argue more openly. The thought did not scare him the way it might have the night before. Instead, it felt like a necessary step toward clarity. Daniel stood up and shook Grace's hand. "Thank you for helping me think this through." Grace smiled. "That is what friends are for." As Daniel stepped back out onto the busy Columbus sidewalk, he felt a new sense of direction replacing the confusion that had followed him since the family dinner. The lottery ticket had opened a door to a different future, but now he understood something important. Walking through that door would require more than luck. It would require careful decisions about who truly had a place beside him on the other side. 2 days later, Daniel drove back to his parents' house just before sunset. The sky above the quiet Ohio neighborhood was turning a soft shade of orange, and the familiar street looked exactly the same as it always had. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. A neighbor watered the lawn across the street. From the outside, nothing about the evening suggested that anything important was about to happen. Daniel parked his pickup truck along the curb and sat for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The folder containing the information Grace had given him lay on the passenger seat beside him, and inside that folder was a business card with the name Michael Turner printed in clean black letters. Earlier that morning, Daniel had already spoken with the attorney over the phone and scheduled a formal consultation for the following week. The conversation had been calm, professional, and very clear about one thing. Any decision Daniel made about the money would remain entirely his. That single fact had given him more peace of mind than anything he had heard since the night of the family dinner. When Daniel stepped onto the porch and knocked lightly on the door, Linda opened it almost immediately, as if she had been expecting him. Her expression was polite but observant. "I thought you might stop by," she said as she stepped aside to let him enter. The familiar smell of dinner drifted from the kitchen again, though this time the table was already cleared except for 3 cups of coffee. Melissa sat near the window with her arms crossed loosely, watching Daniel with quiet curiosity. Robert Harper stood near the counter, his posture relaxed but attentive. Daniel could sense immediately that everyone understood this visit had a purpose. Linda gestured toward the chair at the table. "Have you had time to think about what we discussed?" she asked calmly. Daniel sat down and placed the folder from Grace on the table in front of him. The simple motion drew everyone's attention. "Yes," he answered. "I have." Melissa leaned forward slightly. "And?" Daniel opened the folder and removed the business card. "I spoke with an attorney this morning," he said. Linda's expression remained composed, though the pause before she responded was slightly longer than usual. "Our attorney?" she asked carefully. Daniel shook his head. "No, my attorney." The room grew quiet. Robert remained still near the counter, but Daniel noticed a faint hint of approval in his father's expression. Melissa looked uncertain. "What does that mean?" she asked. Daniel spoke calmly, choosing his words with the same careful clarity he had practiced in his mind during the drive over. "It means I am not signing anything until I fully understand every option, and it means the decisions about the money will stay with me." Linda folded her hands together on the table. For a moment she said nothing. Daniel could almost see her reorganizing the situation in her mind, adjusting the careful plan she had built over the past few days. Finally she nodded slowly. "That is a responsible choice," she said. Melissa looked surprised by her mother's calm reaction. Robert stepped forward and took a seat at the table for the first time that evening. The 4 of them sat quietly for a moment, the tension that had filled the house earlier in the week slowly shifting into something more balanced. Daniel looked around the familiar kitchen where he had spent most of his life learning what family meant. Winning the lottery had not changed who he was, but it had revealed something important about everyone involved. Opportunities did not just bring excitement. They also revealed expectations, intentions, and sometimes hidden plans. As the evening light faded through the kitchen window, Daniel realized that the real value of the money had already begun to appear. It had given him the chance to see clearly who respected his independence and who expected to guide it. And from that moment forward, Daniel knew that whatever future the lottery created, it would be built on decisions he chose for himself.